Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulina Muhammad al-Amin, wa na'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Welcome back to our discussion on Javed Ahmed Ghamidi's thoughts and ideas with regard to the traditional religious narrative on religion and state in Islam, and his counter-narrative, of his offering of the counter-narrative to how we've traditionally understood this relationship. We are still in the process of unpacking the traditional narrative, because one of the things, as I've mentioned previously, is that it's important for Ghamidi Sahab that in order to understand the counter-narrative, one has to fully understand and appreciate the narrative itself and where it's coming from and what's motivating it, what's its foundations and sources, and who are the folks putting it forward. If you don't do that, in his view, then not only are you kind of doing a type of injustice to where these ideas are coming from, but you're not fully able to grasp the precise problem that exists, and as a result won't fully appreciate the solution. And this is something in general that, if I may offer, exists within his thinking, that for him, the intellectual exercise of understanding alternative opinions is quite important as one constructs one's own, right? His ideas have with it his own sort of methodology of interpretation, and really his counter-narrative is coming from there as well. This is something which we will get into a little bit once we get to his counter-narrative, where sometimes there are assumptions with regard to certain outcomes as to, oh, well, if the counter-narrative is going to say this, then it must be coming from this background, right? Or some Western philosophical influence, or etc. But with Ghamidi, one of the interesting things, and some of my academic work on him, has been that he is very strict to his methodology of interpretation, right? And that has a particular way in which to view and understand the Quran, and a particular way to view and understand the sunnah, these sort of two, if you will, constitutional sources of Islamic law, and to understand the faith as a whole. And much of it's premised on a real adherence to language, appreciation of language, and the stylistics of language, right? To understand meaning for him, language is essential, right? Having a full appreciation of the Arabic language, particularly the Arabic language in which the Quran was written and which these early writings wrote, which, you know, is a classical Arabic language. Understanding not simply the meaning of words themselves, but the stylistics of that language, the way in which sentences are constructed, the way in which expression takes place. So not the language in its isolated form simply, not just a dictionary language, but when that dictionary language is put together in particular ways and patterns, what meaning that conveyed in that particular linguistic register, right? And hopefully at some point I'll have the opportunity to discuss this methodology in more depth, because it really gives an understanding then of how some of these ideas come about, right? The sort of the intellectual sophistication behind them, the type of the idea that they are actually very much part and parcel of a longer Islamic intellectual heritage. But for now, let us continue our discussion of the traditional narrative and their understanding the traditional understanding of the relationship between religion and state, as understood by Javed Ahmed Ghamidi and expressed in his lecture. We had talked last time about a number of things, but particularly about the fourth point within traditional narrative. We'd mentioned 3 points prior to that. There are 5 total points. And we talked about the first one, the idea within the narrative that shirk, kufr, apostasy needed to be eradicated. The idea of jihad as a method or mechanism to do some of this. The idea of the reestablishment or the establishment of the caliphate, the khilafah, that itself is a key component of this traditional narrative. The notion that religious law needs to be implemented within the state, upon Muslims, that part of the responsibility of the state is to ensure that Muslims are following religious law, that their religious practice is in line. And then finally, the fifth point that we got into, which was the idea that not simply the religious law, but the state has a responsibility with regard to making sure that there are not deviant beliefs, that belief is corrected. Those mistakes in belief among Muslims is corrected, right? And we had sort of concluded last time with the idea that when the state, in the modern context, when the state fails to do that, then what has ended up happening is that individuals have taken that mantle on and taken it upon themselves to then carry out these responsibilities of the state in a vigilante type of fashion, right? There's more to discuss there, but for our purposes, we move to develop the argument a little further. So, correcting belief, correcting aqeedah, correcting faith, and the mistakes in it is seen as a religious duty for the state. But one of the interesting things Ghamidi Sahab points out is that what constitutes faith or what constitutes correct belief is expanded by the fuqaha and within the traditional narrative. Right? He notes that we have a sense of what sort of belief and aqeedah should be from a very famous hadith, right, in which the Prophet, peace be upon him, that the angel Gabriel, comes towards him and, in a setting and is not known to others that that's who he is, but he comes up and he sits right up close to him and begins to ask him a series of questions, looking for the Prophet, peace be upon him, to provide some answers. And among them is this question that he asks, right? Where he says to the Prophet, peace be upon him, he says, فَأَخْبَرْنِي عَنَ الْإِيمَانِ. So then tell me, explain to me, what is this thing called iman or faith, right? And the Prophet, peace be upon him, responds with a number of things. تُؤْمِن بِاللَّهِ, to believe in God, وَمَلَائِكَتِهِ, His angels, وَكُتُبِهِ, the various revelations that have come before, وَرُسُولِهِ, His messengers, وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ, right, and the last day, right, and the good and the bad that exist, right, that have been decreed, right? To some degree, this sort of encapsulates, or is meant to encapsulate, the kind of belief structure, the beliefs, the core beliefs that a Muslim must have. But what Ghamidi Sahab points out is that in the traditional narrative, this list expands. And the most prominent example of that, as he notes, is this whole fierce debate that came up in Islamic history over the idea of whether the Quran was created or not. Right? And it's a deep philosophical discussion, right? But it sort of was this debate among, really pushed by the Mu'tazila, right? A particular group within the Muslims that held certain views. It was opposed by folks like Ibn Hanbal. Others, even Imam Bukhari, seem to adopt notions of it. But it's an idea which essentially boils down to the idea of whether the Quran itself is something that exists eternally, separate from God. And for some, that simply was not possible because it conflicted with the notion of Tawheed. For others, that had to be the reality, right? And that's a very simplistic way to put it, and we don't have time to dig into it. But the idea that this sort of inquiry on the creation or not of the Quran ends up being a litmus test for belief. And the state is involved in it, such that there are people brought before, including folks like Ibn Ahmed and Ibn Hanbal, right, who are brought before the court to see, okay, where are you at on these beliefs? Like on this idea, what is your opinion? And the state got involved in trying to correct deviant belief, but expanded the idea of what constituted belief or not. And you see, within the traditional or classical heritage, books on Aqidah that are full of long lists of what a Muslim must believe, right? And then that list then taps into the responsibility that the state has or should have within the traditional narrative to make sure that all those beliefs are correct within society. And if the deviation in belief gets to the point of kufr, of essentially constituting disbelief, then it is as though they have left the faith, they have become apostates, and that triggers the severe punishment for apostasy. Right? That is the interconnectedness to some of these earlier ideas we had talked about. So for Ghamidi Sahib, these are the 5 points that cover the entire traditional religious narrative on religion and the state. It gives you a sense for, in his view, it gives you a sense of the classical religious mindset, which continues today to influence how those folks with that mindset look at the world, how they think about their relationship with others, how they think about the place of the state in their lives, how they think about the role even of things like international law and treaties, right? All of this for the person whose mindset is crafted by the traditional narrative. This is the prism. That traditional narrative is the prism through which they are going to look at all these issues, according to Ghamidi Sahib. Right? And hence, there is a tremendous amount of power when someone comes forward and says that they are taking a particular act as a consequence of this traditional narrative. It's hugely influential because others who are wedded to that narrative will also potentially find motivation there too, this narrative that is so deeply and intimately connected to religion, to the historical past, to this period of Muslim dominion, that it breeds within the individual a particular emotional, sentimental, and sacred attachment to the narrative. And that then, that level of connection, for Ghamidi Sahib, that then helps explain the motivation, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of that narrative. Inside this narrative, he says, is almost a deep dream, aspiration, a deep hope of reconstituting a glory from the past, a promised sort of dominion, if you will. And as a result, many times those individuals who step forward as the ones who are taking the mantle in pursuit of these aims within the traditional narrative, they get constituted as heroes, right? So we see that from the impact of those who step forward carrying the mantle of jihad for the eradication of kufr in their view, right? Or those who step forward for the reestablishment of a caliphate, right? That despite impracticalities or whatever else, that those ideas tap into this narrative that has constructed this mindset within which those are the hopes and aspirations that should be sought after. So those individuals then root for those people who step forward to take that mantle, right? And people flock to it as a result. And it's not, in Ghamidi Sahib's view, it's not just simply, oh, yeah, these are just the madrasa students who adopt this mindset. No. This is part of the religious narrative. So whoever turns towards religion will usually access this, will usually learn this. So even if they're at the madrasa or they're the university student who has sort of turned now to their faith to rediscover it, they will tap into this narrative, right? They will develop an attachment to this narrative, a pretty deep one, right? And in some respects, their reality will be flipped around. The world as they understood it, Ghamidi Sahib says, won't make sense in the same way. The objectives, the purposes, the relationships, they won't make sense in the same way. He won't look at this world as one of equal nations, because that's not what the traditional narrative is putting forward. The traditional narrative is saying it's Muslim dominion, right? Islam has to dominate, others have to be subjugated. That's the traditional narrative, right? That's coming from a time period where that was how the mindsets were constructed broadly, right? And so this is how he's going to start hearing this attachment that he has to this narrative, and you hear about shirk and kufr and apostasy, and gets disconnected from the world as he knew it, and gets committed then to do what he can with regard to these things within the traditional narrative that are now part of his mindset. He's going to be able to step forward for the cause, to fight for it, to engage in the things that are necessary. He's willing to leave everything else, right? That is how hugely impactful that mindset becomes. It becomes the motivator. It becomes the reason to be. And you need, in Ghamdi's view, to understand why this motivation is there. Right? He says, it's incorrect to take, in some respects, this lazy view that, oh, madrasas teach terrorism. That's not what madrasas teach. They're not teaching terrorism. It's a more complicated situation. Right? He says, most madrasas, according to Ghamdi Sahib, are not really teaching terrorism as we sort of understand it. Right? And that this has to be really pushed back upon. The real challenge, he says, is the narrative that is being taught and what that entails, and then what the consequences are that result from that narrative. That narrative, he says, is creating a mindset, right? And it's situated in the pre-modern medieval past that had a very different set of circumstances. And then it's asserting itself in our present reality. People read the traditional narrative. It informs their mindset, and then they look at their past and look at what's lost, and then they are left with the question as to whether there is a way to make the dream of reconstituting that past a reality. Is there a way to do that? And certainly, that question occurs for the madrasa student, but it occurs for the university student, it occurs for others. Ghamdi Sahib recalls that at one stage, during the first Afghan jihad against the Soviets, there were busloads of people sent to fight jihad from madrasas, right? Who sent these folks out to fight? Was it the Pakistani government? Were they coerced to do it from the government? No. In his view, not really. But it's the religious mindset that had been created up to this point and that mindset saw the opportunity to make reality what they had been aspiring for, or what the narrative had taught them to aspire to. That was the motivation. That's where the motivation came from. And he says that this mindset, this narrative exists and underlies all the major movements within the Muslim world for whom Islam is at the forefront. It may manifest in different forms, but the core idea is there. The narrative motivates across the board. Doesn't matter you're Hizb ut-Tahrir, Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat-e-Islami, Deoband, whoever else, right? And he acknowledges and he says, and I've mentioned this previously as well, that's not to say that there aren't other factors that play in here. Right? That's not to say that economic vulnerability does not have a role in pushing people in a particular way. That's not to say that foreign intervention or even domestic interventions don't have a role. It's not to say that there aren't other factors, but what he's saying is that those other factors, for Ghamdi Sahib, are all secondary. It's the religious narrative that is at the heart of what people are willing to sacrifice themselves for. Right? That's where it is. And so that leaves us with this question of, can we say anything about this narrative? Is this really Islam's narrative? If it's not, then what is the counter narrative? And that is the door that Ghamidi Sahib wishes to open and explore. Right? He went through all of this to give us a sense of where all of this is coming from. And partly he talks about the fact that these ideas, we talked about the Sufi approach, the Salafi approach, Shah Waliullah's approach, Maududi Sahib, but he said, one of the things that's important to know is that there's a key source there, and I alluded to it in previous lectures, that the actual sources for the arguments that exist within the Sufi approach, within the Salafi approach, etc., is the historical record of the first generation after, or the first generation of Muslims, of the Salaf, the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, the companions and successors of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The traditional narrative is produced from the practice of religion that came to exist in this period of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, according to Ghamidi Sahib. Right? And that makes complete sense. Because if you look at that period and we ask the question, what's the primary objective of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een? We'll say it was to extinguish shirk and kufr in the Arabian Peninsula. First point within the traditional narrative. Right? And they go through this period. The Sahaba have a period of dawah, Ghamidi Sahib says. They're telling people about the faith, they're correcting mistakes of shirk, they're telling about the Prophet, peace be upon him, as the final messenger, they're bringing forward his teachings, the teachings of all the prophets to some degree as a result. There's some difficult times, there's migration, then they get political power. And they continue this eradication of shirk and kufr, and now do it in utilizing other methods as well, including jihad. But what we're talking about here is the practices of the past that essentially function as established history, as function and play a role as undeniable truth. We're talking here not about Quran and Sunnah, we're talking about the historical record. And usually what ends up happening is, we have the historical record for the traditional narrative, they'll have the historical record, and then they will connect some hadith, some Quranic verse to explain it. Ghamidi Sahib says that's the method. They'll begin, the focal point will be that historical record. Right? That established history, as Ghamidi Sahib calls it. And when there's some dispute about this established history, then the ulama will point to the Quran, they'll point to the Sunnah to say, look, it's also written here, secondarily. Right? They'll also point to it. It'll be a secondary sort of reference point. That record becomes hugely impactful. It functions essentially, in Ghamidi Sahib's view, as an independent source for the religion itself. Which gives you a sense then of why the Salafi position has such a strong place as it relates to its emphasis and focus on this first generation in their practice. History becomes decisive in some respects. And we can see this to some degree in the period immediately after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him's death. What's the biggest issue, Saab says, that comes up? It's a wave of apostasy in the region. And not just one or two people, but thousands. Significant number of tribes that had entered Islam wanted to leave or decided to leave. Some folks even started to claim prophethood for themselves. And so what we end up seeing immediately in that period is Abu Bakr's response, the Khalifa, Caliph Abu Bakr, his response, which is the extermination, the eradication of the apostasy that emerges. Right? Goes back to that point about apostasy that's part of the traditional narrative. Right? This is established history that serves as the powerful support for this. Why is eradication of apostasy part of the traditional narrative? It's not coming from Quran, it's not coming from Sunnah primarily, it's coming from the established historical record. What did Sayyidina Abu Bakr do? The Quran and Sunnah may support that secondarily, but it's that established history that's functioning as decisive truth, that's functioning as history that's decisive, that ends up being the source. Right? It's possible for you to argue around, Ghamidi Sahib says, an interpretation of the Quran or interpretation of Sunnah. But in some respects, if you're going to use established history in this way as decisive, it's hard to argue with those facts. That's what happened, right? And part of the idea behind that is this sense to which the proximity of this first generation to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, gives their practice, the record of their history, an elevated status to the point where what we understand as something that certainly occurred or that they certainly did during that time comes to be decisive as it relates to our understanding of what religion requires from us. And we see that throughout the traditional narrative, as Ghamidi Sahib explains. Eradication of shirk and kufr, the role of jihad, the establishment of the caliphate, all of these things are these products of that established history, right? Of that established history. And so, where do we go from here? We see the role of history as functioning almost as undeniable truth, and then we begin to apply it in a series of ways to the things within the traditional narrative. And from that, we get a sense of then where potentially the traditional narrative might have gone astray. And then the doors that might need to be opened to set it right. And those doors for Ghamidi Sahib are the Quran and the Sunnah as the focal points. And I hope to continue this discussion and get to how he suggests opening those doors and what consequence that has on reconstructing the religious narrative around this relationship between the state and Islam. وقولي قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم وسائر المسلمين والحمد لله رب العالمين.